Greetings, Turok.
A month or so ago, I worked on a video for the first Turok, and in that one, I talked about just how big this series was for me growing up. Turok Dinosaur Hunter introduced me to the character in the Lost Land, but Turok 2 is where that attachment really set in. This game took so much of what the first one established and just kept building on it. The levels became more complicated, the weapons got crazier, the enemies got more detailed, there was more story, more to collect, more to actually accomplish inside each world. It felt like everything had another layer added onto it. And when I started recording this video and that intro music kicked in, I was immediately sent back to the living room at my grandma's house. I could see myself sitting there replaying that first level over and over again, because as a kid, I could never figure out how to complete all the objectives. I didn't really care about that though. I was perfectly happy just running around fighting enemies and seeing how far into the level I could get. In the last video, I also talked about how Turok was probably the first FPS character I really looked up to. I knew who Duke Nukem and Doom Guy was, but Turok was the one that actually stuck with me. I used to keep a collection of sticks outside and pretend each one was a different weapon. Like I had this endless Turok arsenal I could pull from whenever I wanted. And even though I never got very far into these games as a kid, this series has stayed very special to me. These games bring back memories of my late great aunt and late great grandma. That house from the early 1900s that was falling apart, and part of my childhood that I can still picture incredibly clearly. So coming back to Turok 2 all these years later, I wanted to understand what Iguana was actually doing with this sequel. How much further did they push the foundation of the first game? Why did Seeds of Evil become one of the most brutal shooters of the 5th generation? What was Turok 2 Seeds of Evil?
Activate 3 distress beacons. Rescue 4 children. Activate the warp portals. Locate the energy totem and defend it at all costs.
So let's take a look at what happened after Turok Dinosaur Hunter, because understanding where Acclaim and Iguana were after that first game really helps explain just how ambitious Seeds of Evil became. I went through most of the history behind Turok in the first video, so I'm not going to run through all that again here. If you want to learn more about how the series and that first game came together, go check out the first video. The important thing to remember here though is that Acclaim had a lot riding on that game, and Turok delivered. Within a few months, Acclaim said Turok had already brought in more than $60 million in worldwide retail sales. During the company's physical quarter ending in May '97, the game made up 57% of Acclaim's total revenue. And by the end of its run, it had sold around 1.5 million copies. So pretty quickly, Turok became the big new series people started associating with Acclaim. CEO Gregory Fishbach would eventually call Turok the most successful third-party N64 game up to that point. And you can really see how much things started changing for Acclaim after that. By 1998, the company's annual revenue had jumped from $165 million to more than $326 million, with N64 games making up well over half that business. Turok wasn't the only reason Acclaim turned things around, but it had definitely become one of the company's biggest brands. The interesting thing is that Iguana wasn't sitting around waiting to see if the first game worked before thinking about another one. Work on Turok had already started around the time Dinosaur Hunter was hitting stores, so the sequel was being talked about pretty early on. Once Turok really took off, Acclaim confirmed that another N64 game was in the works, so there was already confidence in what Iguana was building. Then the first game actually released and proved there was a huge audience for it. And from everything the developers have said about Turok 2, they took that opportunity seriously. Lead designer David Dinspear said the goal was basically to improve the first game in every way they could, and to do it on a much bigger scale. That meant reworking major parts of the game, things like the art and level design, because they wanted the sequel to feel like a real step forward, and I really think it was. You can still see a lot of Dinosaur Hunter in Seeds of Evil, but the whole project had gotten a lot bigger. Development for this took about 21 months, and from what I read, the team put in more than 10,000 hours of testing before the game was finished. The main group was still pretty small compared to modern dev teams, with most of the same people from the original game. Then some new ones started joining as production ramped up. One of the easiest ways to see how much the game had grown is to look at something as simple as the cartridge. Early in development, Turok 2 was being designed around a 12 megabyte cartridge, which would have put it roughly in the same range as the first game. As cartridge prices came down, that plan expanded to 16 megabytes. That extra room opened the door for Iguana to start working multiplayer into the game. And development just kept growing from there. By the time Seeds of Evil was finished, it shipped on a 32 megabyte cartridge, 4 times the storage used by the original Turok. And I think that progression says a lot about the project. They started out making a sequel that would fit on a cartridge about the same size as the first game. Then they got more space and started finding ways to use it. By the end, Turok 2 was sharing the title of one of the biggest N64 cartridges around, with Ocarina of Time. Even previews at the time were already talking about the cartridge size as one of the reasons the game felt like such a big deal. The technology underneath it was getting a major overhaul as well. Iguana took the engine from the first Turok and kept pushing it further. The sequel could handle more complicated environments, better lighting, and characters with a lot more detail. They also worked hard on extending the draw distance, especially since the fog in the first game had become one of the most noticeable technical limitations. At the time, previews were saying the new geometry system could handle several times more detail than the original, and you could immediately tell that they were able to see a lot farther into the environments. That fog is actually a good little example of how Iguana was approaching the sequel. In Dinosaur Hunter, the N64 could only handle so much of those huge environments at once, so the heavy fog helped hide where the game stopped drawing everything. For Turok 2, the team knew the hardware a lot better and had more tools to work with. They could see farther into the world, and they started using the fog more as part of the look and just atmosphere of certain areas. Then another piece of hardware gave them even more room to experiment. At some point during development, Iguana got its hands on Nintendo hardware with the extra memory that would eventually become the N64 Expansion Pak. That little add-on gave the system another 4 megabytes of RAM, and Iguana quickly started finding ways to use it. With the Expansion Pak installed, Turok 2 could run an optional high-resolution mode. At E3 in 1998, the game was being shown running at resolutions that was extremely impressive for an N64 title at the time. Ryan Tracy, who worked as an artist at Iguana, he later said the Expansion Pak was one of the best things that happened to N64 development because it let them fit a lot more onto the screen. And even with that extra memory, Iguana could still overwhelm the hardware. Tracy talked about adding enough objects and particle effects to make the N64 start chugging, which meant the developers still had to figure out where the new limits were and pull things back when they pushed too far. I really love that detail around this because it gives you a pretty good picture of what was happening inside this project. Every time Iguana got some more breathing room, they went looking for the next ceiling. And that same attitude eventually spread beyond the single-player game. During the time between the two Turok games, GoldenEye came out and became a huge deal, especially for 4-player multiplayer. Iguana was paying attention to that. Ryan Tracy had talked about how much GoldenEye influenced the multiplayer in Turok 2. And Denspear also went over what his team wanted to try with their own version of Deathmatch. As the cartridge grew and the team gained the space to include it, multiplayer became another major piece of Seeds of Evil. We'll come back to where that ultimately led the series later in the video, because multiplayer ends up becoming important to what Acclaim does with Turok after this. For now though, the bigger point is that Turok 2 was being developed in a very different FPS landscape. The first game came out early in the N64's life, and helped show that a first-person shooter could work incredibly well on that system. By the time Iguana was finishing the sequel, GoldenEye had raised expectations for what a console shooter could offer, and the genre itself was moving really fast. So Iguana had its own successful game to follow, a much stronger franchise behind it, and a console audience that had already seen the bar move again. That put a lot of attention on Seeds of Evil before it ever hit the store shelves. Acclaim originally wanted October of 1998 to be a big month for the game. They were even calling the whole promotion Turoktober, but that release got pushed back, and then it got pushed back again. By the time everything was finished, Turok 2 was set to come out in North America on December 10th. It sounds like the delays mostly came down to fixing the last few bugs and getting a game this big through the final stages of development and approval. And Acclaim was spending a lot of money to promote it. They put around $9 million into marketing Seeds of Evil with TV and print ads, plus a big push in stores. At the time, GameSpot even called it the most anticipated third-party N64 game of 1998. That's a pretty wild place for the series to reach when you remember where the first game's story started. Acclaim had originally entered Turok with a company that was rebuilding itself and desperately needed stronger games. Less than 2 years later, Turok 2 was arriving on one of the largest cartridges available for the N64, supporting Nintendo's new memory expansion and carrying a multi-million-dollar advertising campaign behind it. The expectations had grown right alongside the game, and that seems to be the best way to understand what Iguana was doing going into Seeds of Evil. They had spent the first game figuring out what Turok could be in a first-person shooter. Now they had the technology and the success of that game behind them. and they wanted to see how far that foundation could stretch. The result was a sequel built on a much larger production than the game that came before it. And you feel that increase in scope almost immediately once Joshua Fireseed actually enters the Lost Land. Once you actually step into the Lost Land, one of the first things you notice is how much the structure of these levels has changed. Dinosaur Hunter had some massive levels. A lot of them were built around these wide jungle areas with paths branching off in different directions. You could spend a long time wandering around looking for keys, and there was always that feeling that another trail might lead somewhere important. Turok 2 keeps that sense of wondering, but the areas themselves have been built in a very different way. They feel a lot denser. You move through streets, buildings, swamps, caverns, and eventually places that feel completely different from where the game started. Indoor areas lead back outside, paths loop around to places you've already been, and switches keep opening up new routes further ahead. It creates this weird feeling where I usually had no idea where I was, but I could still tell I was making progress. If I walked into an area I hadn't seen before, that was enough. I was going somewhere. And the more time I spent with these levels, the more I started realizing they almost work like a weave. You keep moving forward, but the path is constantly bending around itself. A route might take you through several new areas before eventually reconnecting near somewhere you've already been. That connection gives you another point of reference, then another path carries you deeper into the level. Some worlds lean harder into that structure than others. The Death Marshes feel pretty straightforward. There are still side paths throughout the swamp, but most of the time you get the sense that you're steadily making your way forward. The Lair of the Blind Ones feels completely different. That level's built around going down. Each section has its own collection of branching tunnels and looping routes. And eventually you're looking for the way deeper into the cavern, and once you find it, the process starts again below you. Then the final world handles things a little differently. There's a big central area with paths branching off in different directions. You follow one of them, work your way through that section, and eventually loop back around to the center, where another path's waiting. That variety really helps because each world has its own way of being navigated. And the Port of Adia gives you a pretty good introduction to what the sequel expects from you. That first level is big, but I don't think it's too hard to figure out. You can follow the main route pretty easily, and most of the important paths are clear enough that you can start getting used to the game's new systems without feeling completely lost. There are still things sitting away from that obvious path. Some of the children you need to rescue are tucked away down side paths or in areas you could easily walk right past. And that starts teaching you something early. Getting further into the level doesn't necessarily mean you're finished with that area behind you. That becomes a huge part of how Turok 2 handles progression.
Child rescued.
Thank you, Turok.
The hub from the first game returns, but in a different form. You find level keys throughout the worlds and bring them back to the hub, where they open the portals leading further into the Lost Land. There's still some flexibility in which levels you unlock first, so that familiar Turok structure is sitting underneath everything. The keys themselves usually weren't what made me search every corner of a level though. A lot of them are placed along routes you're naturally going to travel while progressing through the world. The mission objectives are what changed how I looked at everything around those routes. Every world now gives Joshua actual jobs to complete. In the Port of Adia, you're searching for captured children and activating distress beacons as you work through the city. Eventually, you reach the energy totem and have to defend it. Other levels give you their own set of problems to deal with, and having those objectives changed the feeling of entering a new world for me. In the first game, the main thing on my mind was finding keys and eventually locating the Chronoceptor piece. Here, I was always keeping track of what still needed to be done.
Rescue 5 prisoners. Destroy 3 ammunition storage facilities.
If I got near the end of a level and realized I still had an objective left, I'd turn around and start checking places I'd missed, or a path split earlier and I only followed one direction. That made the side paths more important because the game was constantly giving you reasons to investigate them. And I think that's one of the biggest changes in how these worlds feel. Each place has something happening inside it. You're entering an area where people need help, or where something needs to be taken care of. And finishing those objectives makes it feel like Joshua actually has a reason to be there. It made me feel like Turok was actually having an impact on the world he was moving through. The game also gives you a tool for figuring out where the unfinished business might be. You can pull up a wireframe map of the level, and the map gradually fills in as you explore. At first, it can be kinda hard to read, but eventually I started understanding what it was showing me, and it became one of the main ways I tracked down areas I'd missed. If I reached the end of a level with an objective still unfinished, I could look at the map and search for places where the wireframe looked incomplete. Maybe a hallway suddenly stopped, or there was a section nearby that I hadn't filled in yet. That gave me somewhere to start looking. And this is where the initial feeling of being slightly lost starts changing. When I first entered one of these worlds, I was usually just wandering through unfamiliar areas and assuming that finding something new meant I was going the right way. As the map filled in, I started recognizing where different routes connected. The level gradually became easier to understand and remember. By the time I had actually completed one, I usually felt pretty confident in moving through it again. That ends up being extremely important because Turok 2 gives you several reasons to come back to levels. The first game kept the major collectibles pretty focused. You were searching for level keys and chronoceptor pieces. Turok 2 starts layering several different progression items into these worlds, and each one gives you something else to keep track of. The level keys still control access through the hub. Sacred eagle feathers lead towards new talisman abilities. Primagen keys are hidden throughout the worlds and become important later. The nuke weapon is also broken into components that have to be found across the game, so while I was working through a level, I could have several things sitting in my head at the same time. Maybe I had already found the keys, but I still needed the feather. There was an objective I hadn't finished. I had passed an area earlier that clearly required an ability I didn't have yet, and I actually enjoyed keeping track of all that. It gave me this constant sense that I could plan ahead. I might find the sacred eagle feather and immediately know that my next step was returning to the offering point. Then that leads to a new talisman. Now I can survive in dangerous waters. And because I'd already seen one of those areas in an earlier world, I knew exactly where I wanted to go once the current level was finished. That creates progression across the game as a whole. An obstacle you find in one world can stay in your head while you're playing through another one. Then several hours later, the game gives you the thing you need and that old location becomes relevant again. The talismans are what make that possible. There are 5 of them spread across the game, and each gives Joshua a different ability that allows him to pass certain environmental barriers. When I found one of those barriers before having the right talisman, I usually made a mental note of it. I knew I would have to come back. The Primagen key gives those return trips their biggest purpose. A lot of them are placed behind abilities you acquire later, so completing one level can give you the means to reach something important inside a world you've already finished. That creates a nice long-term connection between the levels. The usefulness of the other talisman areas are a bit more mixed for me though. There are quite a few places where an ability can lead you towards ammunition or life force tokens. Most of my time in the game, I was sitting at max lives, so I couldn't even pick up more life force tokens. That meant some of those gated routes stopped being especially valuable once I knew there wasn't a Primagen key behind them. The Primagen key areas were the ones I really remembered, because they gave the abilities a clear role in the larger progression. And going back for them would have been a lot more exhausting if Turok 2 made you replay these massive levels from the beginning every time. That's where the checkpoint system really becomes important. Throughout each world, you'll find warp portals that act as checkpoints. Once you activate one, it becomes part of a network connecting the areas you've already reached. You can warp to another activated checkpoint, move between levels, or return to the hub. While inside the portals, Adon can also restore things like health and ammo. For me, their bigger purpose was how they divided the levels into these smaller manageable sections though. If I remembered that something I needed was somewhere around the middle of an earlier level, I didn't have to run through the entire world again trying to reach it. I could warp to a checkpoint near that section and start searching from there. So by the time the game begins asking you to revisit older worlds, you've already built a network through them. You know the level better, the map shows where you've been, the checkpoints give you a way to get close to where you need to go, and the ability you just earned gives you a specific reason for returning. That's why the backtracking really works for me. I was usually going back with a plan, and all this changes what exploration means compared with the first game. Turok 1 gave you these enormous levels and asked you to wander through them searching for the pieces required to keep moving. Turok 2 takes that wandering and starts layering responsibilities onto it. You're paying attention to where you've been, you're looking for objectives away from the obvious routes. You're remembering barriers that might matter later. Then you gradually learn these huge levels well enough that a return trip becomes something you can navigate with more of a purpose. One thing that's really been pulled back in this sequel is the platforming. The original Turok could dedicate huge sections of a level just to jumping. There were rooms built around narrow platforms and long sequences where one bad jump could cost you a life. Turok 2 still asks you to jump across things occasionally, but I don't think there's anything here that reaches the scale of the platforming sections from the first game. The largest sequence I can remember in this is maybe 8 platforms, 8 jumps. Most of the time you cross something and keep moving. The complexity is shifted towards understanding the level itself, and the environments you're moving through have become a lot more varied. That was probably one of the biggest things that changed how I saw the Lost Land while replaying these games. In Dinosaur Hunter, you traveled through several different areas, but they all felt like they belonged to the same larger place to me. There was this consistent sense that you were moving through different regions of one world. Turok 2 opens that idea up dramatically. The port of Adia feels completely removed from the Death Marshes, then you descend into the lair of the Blind Ones. Later, you're moving through places like the Hive of the Mantids, where the environment feels like it belongs to a different universe altogether. The way those worlds are inhabited reinforces that feeling, and we'll get into the enemies themselves when we talk about combat. But for an environmental perspective, it starts making the Lost Land feel enormous in a way the first game never really did for me. Every portal can drop you somewhere that looks completely different and has its own way of leading you around. It starts feeling like the Lost Land can contain entire realities inside of it. And that makes the structure of Turok 2 make a lot more sense to me. These levels are huge because you're meant to spend time learning them. The missions give you reasons to search beyond the route in front of you. The collectibles leave unfinished threads running between worlds. Then the talismans eventually send you back through places that felt almost impossible to understand the first time you entered them. But by that point, you've learned them. You found the checkpoints, you filled in the map. So the same world that initially had you wandering around slightly lost eventually becomes somewhere you know well enough to return with a specific job in mind. And I think that's where Turok 2's exploration really finds its identity. The Lost Land keeps giving you somewhere new to wander into, while the systems surrounding those spaces gradually teach you how to find your way back. One of the things that always stood out about Turok is the arsenal. Even in Dinosaur Hunter, you start with pretty normal weapons and gradually work your way into technology that feels like it belongs somewhere completely different. Turok 2 takes that idea and keeps going with it for almost the entire game. And before getting into the weapons themselves, there's actually a piece of Turok lore that helps explain how Joshua is carrying all this stuff in the first place. It's called the Light Burden. In the wider Acclaim era Turok mythology, the Light Burden is basically the little satchel Turok carries around. It's connected to the Turok lineage and gives whoever holds the mantle access to a huge supply of weapons and equipment. Later stories would expand on the idea and make the Light Burden a much bigger part of the mythology. Turok 2 never stops the game to sit down and explain all that, but I like knowing it exists. It gives some kind of in-universe reasoning for how Joshua can walk around carrying what eventually becomes an insane number of weapons. Otherwise, in my head, Turok would be running around the Lost Land with half an armory hanging off his back. The Light Burden gives the arsenal a place inside the world, and Turok 2 gives that thing a lot to carry. The weapon progression in this game felt like it just kept going. I would get deep into a level thinking I'd probably found everything by that point. Then another weapon would show up, and then another one. And the further you get, the more Iguana starts having fun with what those weapons can actually do. The first game already had some strange technology in it, and especially once you reach the later parts of the arsenal. Turok 2 pushes that even further. What I like is that even the weapons that are technically upgrades usually have enough mechanical differences to justify keeping both around. The shotgun and shredder are a good example. The shotgun works exactly how you'd expect. You fire a spread at close range and it does a lot of damage. The shredder uses the same basic shotgun ammo, but the weapon itself works completely different. It condenses that shot into an energy projectile that can ricochet off surfaces. So even though one weapon grows out of the other, they still feel different roles when you're actually playing. The same thing happens with the plasma rifle and the firestorm cannon. The plasma rifle fires these powerful individual shots, then the firestorm cannon takes those same plasma cells and turns them into a minigun. You hold the trigger and pour energy into whatever's standing in front of you. The Mag 60 takes the normal pistol and gives it a burst fire. The Warblade is probably the closest example of a straight upgrade, because mechanically it fills basically the same role as the Talon while hitting harder. That means the arsenal keeps getting wider without constantly making the previous weapons feel pointless. Alternate ammo adds another layer on top of that. The Tech Bow became one of my favorite ways to fight enemies at long range. With tech arrows loaded and the scope attached to Turok's headpiece, you can basically turn the bow into a sniper rifle. Those arrows hit hard enough that I would use them to pick off enemies before they even got close to me. Then the shotgun family has explosive shells you can switch over to when you need more damage. I usually save those for situations where I wanted to move through an area faster or kill something before I had much time to run up on me. So by the time the arsenal really starts filling out, you've got a lot of options sitting on top of each other. You can choose the weapon, you can choose the ammo, and then eventually the game starts handing you things that feel like somebody on the dev team was asking what the most ridiculous possible version of a Turok weapon could be. The Cerebral Bore is probably the weapon everybody thinks of first. The gun locks onto the brain activity of an enemy and fires this little projectile that tracks them. Once it reaches the target, it attaches to the head and starts drilling. The whole process takes a second. You have to stay aimed long enough to get the lock, and then wait for the bore to actually reach them. If it connects, the enemy's done. And somehow, even with how completely insane the weapon is, I used it a lot. It works. There's enough risk in needing the lock and waiting for the projectile that it still feels like something you're actively using instead of pressing a button and watching an animation happen. Den Spirit said the Cerebral Bore was partly inspired by his love for Phantasm, while the Razor Wind came from Kroll. He also talked about how the team's dismemberment tech started shaping the weapons they came up with. Once they realized what they could do to enemy bodies, they started designing guns that could really show it off. Oh, that didn't kill him? 3 exploding barrels right out of his knees didn't kill him? That's crazy. The Razor Wind became another favorite for me. It shows up really late, and I ended up using it through most of that area. It's basically this spinning saw blade that you throw around like a boomerang. It hits incredibly hard, comebacks to you, and feels like the perfect over-the-top weapon for that point in the game. I kept using it when I went back through earlier worlds also, looking for things I had missed because it was so effective. Then there's the nuke. The nuke has almost the same problem for me that the Chronoceptor had in the first game. You spend the entire game collecting the pieces for it, and by the time the weapon is finally assembled, you're basically at the end of the game. So you get this massive late game payoff without much game left to actually use it in. Still, by the time Joshua is carrying weapons like the Razor Wind and the nuke, you can see just how far the arsenal has traveled from the beginning of the game. And the enemies evolve right alongside it. Turok 2 has a lot more enemy types than the first game. There's around 35 different kinds spread throughout the worlds. The early levels lean pretty heavily on the dino hybrid types that keep showing up throughout the game. The raptoids, entrails, leapers. Those become part of the basic combat design pretty quickly. Then the death marshes bring the Perlin back into the series, and they're carrying their own heavy weapons. Some rush you with energy blades, others can unload on you with miniguns. Later worlds start bringing in enemies that fit more specific environments. The mantid areas have enemies capable of moving through the air, along with these larger enemies that do a lot more damage. At the broadest level, most of these enemies are still filling similar roles. Some are trying to get close to you, others are attacking from a distance. The way they move and the amount of pressure they create changes enough that the fights keep feeling different as you move from one world to the next.
Everything.
And the enemy AI feels a lot smarter this time around. Enemies will try to take cover. You'll see them dodge roll away from your shots. They move around while attacking instead of just standing in one place trading damage with you. That makes the fights feel a lot more active than they did in Dinosaur Hunter. Reviews at the time noticed the same thing, calling out enemies that used cover, dodged attacks, and changed behavior depending on the situation. The devs also built systems for pathfinding and target tracking, with groups of enemies even capable of following a leader. There's a pretty clever technical trick underneath some of that. The N64 could only handle so much at once, so Iguana spreads some of those AI calculations out across multiple frames. One enemy could perform a pathfinding calculation during one frame, then another would get its turn. From the player's perspective, you still see a group of enemies moving around with some awareness of the environment. The console just isn't trying to solve every one of those paths at the exact same time. The one place where I really noticed enemies reacting to how overwhelming Turok was came during the mounted Styracosaurus section. When you come charging through there, some enemies start running in a panic. Otherwise, I never really noticed enemies changing behavior based on the specific weapon I had equipped. But I constantly noticed how much more movement there were in fights in general. And the bigger change is what happens when your shots actually connect. The collision system in Turok 2 is way more detailed than the first game. Dinosaur Hunter mostly treated each enemy like one big hitbox. Turok 2 can recognize individual parts of the body and assign different properties to them. That means if you shoot between someone's legs, you can actually miss. If you hit their armor, the armor takes the hit instead. And if you hit an exposed part of their body, the game registers that separately. The devs were even assigning different damage values to specific parts of the enemies. And you notice that stuff pretty early. The entrails are one of the best early examples. If you shoot the weapon attached to their arm, you can see sparks fly off it, and you haven't really hit the enemy itself. The bows can make the precision even easier to see because the arrows stick where they land. You can look at an enemy afterwards and see exactly where you shot him. Different body parts also react differently when you hit them. You shoot an arm and the enemy can grab it in pain. Do enough damage there and the arm can completely come off, or heads can get blown off. Perlin can have actual holes blasted through their torsos. That level of location-specific reaction is pretty insane for an N64 game. This is probably why I consider Turok 2 the most brutal game on the N64. The game is extremely violent, but the violence is tied directly to what the weapons are doing. For me, it just feels visceral. When something gets hit with a powerful weapon, you see the result on the body. The blood effects are heavy enough that the impact feels just brutal. Different enemy types can even bleed different colors, with the mantids and some of the more alien-like creatures using green blood instead of red. The developers built the character models around that damage system also. Alan Johnson talked about building the enemies so different levels of damage could reveal things like bones and organs. The team could swap out parts of the model and trigger different animations depending on what had happened to the body. And then you get to something like the Cerebral Bore, where all that technology gets pushed about as far as it can go. Once the bore attaches to somebody's head, blood starts coming out while this gray fluid mixes into it. That little detail tells what the weapon's actually doing. It's drilling directly into their skull and into their brain. The whole animation takes something completely ridiculous and makes it feel nasty. And I think that's why the Cerebral Bore became such an iconic Turok weapon. The idea itself is memorable. The damage system gives the idea a payoff that people remember seeing. The same thing applies across the rest of the arsenal. The Shredder feels dangerous because you see what the projectile does when it connects. The Firestorm cannon feels powerful because enemies react to being shredded by the stream of plasma. The Razor Wind feels ridiculous because bodies actually respond to this giant spinning blade being thrown through them. The weapon and the damage systems are feeding into each other, and that was apparently part of the design process. Dean Spear had talked about wanting the arsenal to keep escalating as the game went on. New enemies would show up and make things harder, and then Turok would find a weapon that helped him even things out. I thought that progression worked really well. I never really reached a point where I felt underpowered. The enemies keep getting tougher as the worlds get stranger, and Joshua keeps finding things capable of dealing with them. By the end, you've got several options that can kill normal enemies almost instantly. And because the weapons keep arriving for so long, that combat progression stays active through most of the game. You can start Turok 2 with a bow in your hands. Several levels later, you're carrying a brain-seeking drill and throwing a buzzsaw boomerang at alien creatures. Somehow, all that still feels completely normal in Turok. The light burden gives the arsenal a place in the mythology. The weapon progression keeps expanding what Joshua can do. Then the enemy design gives all that firepower something worthy of using it on. And I think that's what makes the combat in Turok 2 work so well. As the Lost Land gets weirder, the arsenal keeps finding new ways to keep up with it.
Queen embryo destroyed.
So now that we know how Turok 2 plays, I think it's worth looking at what Joshua is actually trying to accomplish here. Because the story has a much larger role in Seeds of Evil. The whole thing starts with a decision made at the end of the first game. After defeating the campaigner, Talset is left with the Chronoscepter. He knows how dangerous that weapon is, so he decides to destroy it by throwing it into an active volcano. The destruction sends a violent shock through the Lost Land, and somewhere deep inside the place, something wakes up. The Primagen. The Primagen is an ancient alien being whose history goes all the way back to the creation of the Lost Land itself. According to the game's backstory, his light ship became trapped in the Netherscape near the beginning of time. The forces surrounding that event helped pull pieces of different worlds together, creating this strange collision of places that would eventually become the Lost Land. The Primagen remained trapped inside the wreckage of that ship for ages. The Elders of the Lost Land understood how dangerous he was. These Elders are known as the Lazarus Concordants, and they erected 5 energy totems at locations where the Primagen power could be contained. Those totems use temporal energy to keep him bound to his light ship. If all 5 are destroyed, the Primagen can break free. And according to Adon, the resulting release of temporal energy would tear through reality and destroy Joshua's universe. So Talset destroying the Chronoscepter ends one threat and unknowingly wakes up another one that's been buried inside the Lost Land for an unimaginable amount of time. By the time Turok 2 begins, the mantle of Turok has also moved on. Joshua Fireseed is the new Turok. The Acclaim continuity treats Turok as a title passed through the Fireseed lineage, and Joshua inherits that responsibility after his uncle, Carl Fireseed. The game itself doesn't spend much time explaining that history. Joshua arrives already carrying the mantle and is immediately pulled into the crisis surrounding the Primagen. The person guiding him through all this is Adon, the Speaker of Forever Light. Adon works on behalf of the Lazarus Concordants, and she becomes Joshua's connection to what's happening across the Lost Land. Every time Joshua enters another world, Adon explains who lives there, what Primagen has done to them, and what needs to happen before Joshua can move on. Her first briefing sends him to the port of Adia. The port was once a peaceful coastal settlement. By the time Joshua arrives, the dinosaurs have torn through it. The city has been devastated, survivors are being hunted down, and children have been captured during the attack. The dinosaurs themselves are genetically engineered dinosaur hybrids serving Primagen, though they have their own interest in seeing humanity wiped out also. Joshua's job in Adia is essentially damage control. He activates distress beacons so help can reach the surviving population, rescues the children scattered through the city, and eventually reaches the first energy totem before Primagen's forces can destroy it. That first world sets up the larger pattern of Joshua's journey. Primagen has started turning different parts of the Lost Land against each other. Sometimes he's using force, sometimes he's offering people something they want, and in other places he's taking advantage of threats that were already there. That becomes much clearer when Joshua reaches the River of Souls. The River of Souls has always been poisonous. Nothing that drinks from it survives. The Lazarus Concordants placed one of the energy totems along its banks, and the energy from that totem began purifying the water around it. That allowed the city of Ara Issi to grow beside the river. For years, the city prospered, and as peace settled in, its military presence gradually weakened. Primagen's forces take advantage of that. By the time Joshua arrives, the dinosaur vanguard had already swept through Ara Issi and massacred most of the population. Then things get even worse. Soul gates have opened inside the city, allowing armies of the dead to pour into it. 3 beings known as the Sisters of Despair are helping drive that invasion. So Joshua pushes through what's left of Ara Issi, closes the soul gates, and secures the energy totem that had allowed life to exist along the river in the first place. The next major conflict takes him into the Death Marshes. This is where Primagen starts showing how willing he is to manipulate the different races of the Lost Land. The marshes are controlled by the Perlin. They're a powerful race that already resents humanity and sees humans as weak creatures that have been allowed to advance too far. Primagen uses that resentment. He promises the Perlin control over the Lost Land if they help free him. He arms them with advanced weaponry and gives them what they need to wage war. The Perlin believe they're helping build a future where they come out on top. Primagen already plans to wipe them out once they've served their purpose. Joshua enters the marshes while that alliance is still active. Human prisoners are being held there, and the Perlin have stockpiled the weapons and ammunition supplied by the Primagen. Joshua frees the prisoners and destroys those stockpiles before reaching another energy totem. By this point, the scale of Primagen's plan is becoming pretty obvious. He's pulling on old grudges and giving different groups exactly enough of a reason to help him. Then Joshua heads underground into the lair of the Blind Ones. The Blind Ones have lived beneath the Lost Land for countless generations. They spent so long underground that they've lost their sight entirely, while their other senses have become super strong. All the creatures here are capable of hearing a heartbeat and smelling blood from a huge distance. And Joshua's mission here gets pretty dangerous. He moves deeper into their underground home and seals the thermal vents running through the caverns. Doing that causes sections of the lair to collapse and traps the Blind Ones beneath tons of rock. Then he reaches the energy totem and protects it from the surviving enemies in the area. At the bottom of those caverns, Joshua also encounters the massive creature known as the Blind One. This thing is buried deep beneath the lair, with a huge central eye and tentacles stretching through the chamber. Joshua kills it and finally leaves the underground world behind. From there, the war moves into the hive of the Mantids. And the Mantids have their own deal with Primagen. They're an intelligent insectoid species that established a colony inside the Lost Land. Their entire society is built around expanding the species. Primagen promises them access to new worlds they can infest once he's free. Earth is at the top of that list. The Mantids are preparing rift gates that would allow an army to cross into Joshua's world. So his mission inside the hive becomes much bigger than protecting another part of the Lost Land. Earth itself is now directly in their path. Joshua enters the hive and goes after the future of the Mantid colony. He destroys 3 queen embryos that would have continued producing more mantids. Then he destroys the master computer controlling the rift gates, cutting off their planned route to Earth. After protecting the energy totem, Joshua goes deeper into the hive and confronts the mantid queen herself. By the time she goes down, Primagen has lost another major ally. But there's been something else following Joshua through this entire journey. Throughout the game, Joshua encounters fake versions of the talisman portals. Entering them takes him somewhere completely different. These areas are filled with creatures known as the Flesh Eaters, and they seem to be working for a force that has nothing to do with the Primagen's army. That force is Oblivion. At this point, Joshua doesn't really know what Oblivion is. Adon can't identify it either. It keeps interfering with his mission, drawing him into these corrupted areas and throwing Flesh Eaters into his path. So while Joshua is trying to stop Primagen, something else is already watching what he's doing and trying to interfere with him. That thread becomes more important as Joshua reaches the final part of his journey. The last major world is Primagen's lightship itself. This ancient ship has been sitting at the center of everything from the beginning. It's where Primagen has remained trapped, and it's also where his forces are being supplied. The lightship is capable of manufacturing biobots inside automated assembly plants. Primagen has even prepared for the possibility that Joshua might defeat him. If Primagen dies, those biobots are programmed to leave the ship and begin exterminating intelligent life across the Lost Land. So Joshua destroys the assembly plants before confronting him. And while he's inside the ship, he discovers something that connects all the way back to the River of Souls. The river's poisonous state is being caused by waste produced by the lightship's power cells. Joshua reverses the polarity of those cells, removing the toxins that have poisoned the river. That means the water supporting Araisi can finally flow clean without depending on the totem to purify it. It's a small story connection that I really like because something that seemed like a natural part of the Lost Land earlier in the game turns out to have been tied to the Primagen ship the entire time. Before Joshua can finish his mission, the Oblivion thread comes up again. He encounters Mother, a massive flesh eater connected to the same force that's been interfering with him through the false portals. Joshua survives that encounter and returns to the hub with Primagen finally within reach. And this is where the Primagen keys we've been finding throughout the game finally matter to the story. There are 6 of them, with 1 hidden in each world. Together, they open the seal leading into Primagen's chamber. Once Joshua has all 6, there's nothing left between him and the creature that started this entire war. Joshua enters the chamber and finally meets Primagen face to face. Primagen has spent the entire game working through other races and armies. Now, Joshua has reached the source.
I'm well prepared.
The two fight inside the lightship and Joshua eventually brings him down. What happens next depends on how well Joshua protected the energy totems during the journey. If all 5 totems survived, their energy activates after Primagen is defeated. The beams converge on him and completely destroy his body along with the remaining traces of his telepathic power. Adon confirms that Primagen's finally gone and tells Joshua that the Omniverse owes him a debt. There's also a second ending if the totems weren't all protected. Joshua can still defeat Primagen physically. Adon explains that his body's been destroyed and the Netherscape has stabilized, but traces of his mind remain. That leaves the open possibility that Primagen could eventually return. Either way, Joshua's victory still leaves one major problem unresolved. Adon tells him she's been trying to understand the force that kept interfering with his journey. She can't identify it. Every attempt to study it gives her this overwhelming sense of dread. The energy doesn't seem to fit in the normal balance she understands within the universe. And buried inside that signature, Adon detects something familiar. The energy of the Turok lineage. Whatever this thing is, previous Turoks appear to have encountered it before. Then the game ends with a voice delivering one final message. It is inevitable. That's Oblivion. And that one thread is what eventually carries the story forward into Turok 3 Shadows of Oblivion. I think that's one of the biggest differences in how Seeds of Evil handles its story. There's a clear chain connecting the entire journey. Talset destroys the Chronoscepter. That wakes up Primagen. Primagen starts building alliances across the Lost Land and targets the energy totems keeping him trapped. Joshua is brought in as the new Turok and spends the game breaking those alliances apart while protecting the totems. Then by the time Primagen's finally gone, the game has already planted the threat waiting behind him. So Turok 2 leaves Joshua's first major battle finished, with a much larger part of the Turok mythology already opening up around him. So after looking at everything Iguana built in Turok 2, I think the last thing we need to figure out is how people actually responded to it, because Acclaim had a lot riding on this game by the time it finally came out. We already went through the build-up earlier, so I don't want to repeat all that here. The important thing is that expectations were extremely high. Acclaim had turned Turok into one of its biggest series, and the company said about 1.4 million copies of Seeds of Evil had shipped during the holidays. So commercially, the sequel did what Acclaim needed it to do, and critically, the response was strong too. The N64 version currently sits at an 86 on Metacritic, and GameSpot gave it a 9 out of 10 at the time. Their review called it a landmark shooter, and saw it as another major step forward for first-person shooters on consoles. A lot of the praise centered around the same things we've talked about throughout the video. The graphics were a huge part of it also. Reviewers were impressed with how different each world looked and how much more detail Iguana was getting onto the screen compared with the first game. The Expansion Pak mode also got a lot of attention because running Turok 2 in high resolution was a pretty big flex for the N64 at the time. GameSpot put it alongside Ocarina of Time as one of the best looking console games available, and specifically called out the lighting and increased viewing distance. The enemies got plenty of attention too. Critics noticed the better enemy behavior, especially enemies using cover and dodging during fights. The detailed hit reactions stood out as well. You had enemies responding differently depending on where they were shot. And all the gore that came with that made the combat feel more reactive than what people were used to seeing on the N64. And obviously, people noticed the weapons. The Cerebral Bore became one of those things that immediately followed the game's reputation around. It's such a specific idea that you could show somebody that weapon without showing them anything else from the game, and there's a pretty good chance they know exactly what you're talking about. So in a lot of ways, the things Iguana had spent 21 months building were landing exactly where they wanted. People saw the visual jump. They noticed how much more advanced the enemies were, and the arsenal gave Turok 2 an identity that was really hard to confuse with another shooter. The level design is where the response got a bit more interesting. GameSpot's N64 review loved the scale of the game. They praised how the missions and revisiting older areas worked into the overall progression, and felt the levels gave the game a lot of depth. Other people and reviewers had a much rougher time with those same levels. The size could make it extremely easy to lose track of where you were. Missing one important objective or progression item could send you back through a massive area trying to figure out what you had overlooked. And once you're talking about levels this big, having to retrace a large section could take a long time. The PC review from GameSpot hit this much harder and specifically criticized how easy it was to miss something important, and end up wandering back through these huge areas looking for it. I can understand both sides of it. For me, learning these worlds was one of the things I enjoyed about the game. That slight feeling of being lost eventually turned into knowing the level well enough that you could come back later and move through it with a plan. Someone who doesn't enjoy that process is going to have a bit of a different experience. Save points in the original release could be separated by a good amount of playtime. By the time GameSpot reviewed Turok 3, they looked back at Seeds of Evil and specifically called out how some of the saves could take hours to reach. That's a rough commitment if you only have a short amount of time to play. Then there was performance. This is probably where the ambition of Turok 2 ran directly into the limits of the N64. Iguana was pushing more detailed environments onto the screen and running more complicated enemies inside them. Then you've got all the weapon effects and the high resolution mode sitting on top of that. The frame rate could take a hit. Even GameSpot's extremely positive N64 review noted frame drops when the screen became crowded with explosions. And I think that gives some more context to everything that we talked about in the development chapter. Iguana kept finding ways to get more out of the hardware. The cartridge grew, the engine grew with it. The expansion pack gave them more memory to work with. Eventually, you reach a point where the N64 has to actually run everything they're putting into the game. The slowdown is where you can feel that limit. So Turok 2 ended up with this interesting reputation. It was being praised as one of the most technically impressive shooters on the console, while some of the biggest complaints were directly connected to the scale of what Iguana had built. And I think that says a lot about the game. They pushed hard enough that some of the rough edges are sitting right beside the things people were impressed by. Commercially though, all that ambition still paid off. Acclaim said 1.4 million N64 cartridges has shipped around the holiday, and later reported that the N64 roughly sold 1.4 million copies. That's right around the same territory the first game had reached, and with Turok 2 doing well, Acclaim kept moving. One of the first places that happened was multiplayer. I haven't talked about it much because Seeds of Evil is still primarily about this massive single-player campaign, but the N64 version also added 4-player multiplayer. And Iguana already had ideas for taking that much further. Denspear said the idea of Turok Rage Wars was already forming before development on Turok 2 had even finished. The team knew they wouldn't have enough time to fully build out all their multiplayer ideas before Seeds of Evil had to ship for the holiday season, so those ideas became their own game. Rage Wars came out in '99, and took the multiplayer side of Turok almost completely on its own. The tech was already there from Turok 2, which meant the devs could spend more of their time building arenas and working on bots. It's probably the clearest example of how many directions the series was starting to move after Seeds of Evil. A feature that had been added to the sequel suddenly became the foundation for the next game. The problem is that Rage Wars didn't seem to connect with the audience the same way the two main games had. When GameSpot reviewed Turok 3 the following year, they described Rage Wars as ambitious while also saying it had fallen on deaf ears with consumers. I really couldn't find any real sales numbers for Rage Wars. What I can say though is that it didn't carry the same momentum that Dinosaur Hunter and Seeds of Evil had. Then in 2000 we got Turok 3 Shadows of Oblivion. And this is where the ending from the last chapter finally pays off. Oblivion becomes the main threat, and the story continues directly from what Seeds of Evil had been setting up. There was also some interesting changes in the way Turok 3 was designed that seemed to respond directly to complaints surrounding the second game. Saving became much more forgiving, the levels were easier to keep track of. GameSpot's review even talked about the game using more frequent checkpoints and environmental guidance to get rid of that aimless feeling people had complained about in 2. Their final review specifically praised being able to save anywhere, and pointed back to the enormous gaps between save points and Seeds of Evil. So the next game gave us a pretty good idea of which lessons Iguana took forward. The series kept moving from there. By 2002, Acclaim was trying to bring Turok onto the PS2, Xbox, and GameCube with Turok Evolution. That game went back to Tal Set and worked as a kind of prequel to the earlier games. Critically, the response had cooled down a lot by this point. Depending on the platform, the reviews set more in the mixed area. GameSpot landed around a 7 across the major console versions and described it as familiar Turok material that still worked for fans of the series. This is where the history of the game starts getting pretty messy. By 2004, Acclaim itself was in serious trouble. In June of that year, the company received notice from Classic Media, who controlled the Turok license, that Acclaim's rights had been terminated because of unpaid royalties connected to Evolution. That's kind of wild when you think about where this whole story started. Turok had been one of the games that helped Acclaim rebuild itself in the late 90s. 7 years later, Acclaim had lost the license because it couldn't keep up with the royalty payments. A few months after that, the company collapsed. Acclaim filed for Chapter 7 bankruptcy in September of 2004, after failing to secure new financing, bringing the original run of Turok games to an end. The property itself was still there. In 2005, Buena Vista Games, which was Disney's game publishing arm at the time, acquired the video game rights for Classic Media and handed development of a new game to Propaganda Games. That eventually became Turok in 2008. And this was a full reboot. The Lost Land continuity from the Acclaim games were gone, and the new story followed Joseph Turok as part of a military unit stranded on a planet filled with dinosaurs. It was a very different take on the story, and commercially, it got some attention. By March of 2008, Touchstone announced that the reboot had shipped more than 1 million copies worldwide. And that's just shipped, so we don't know exactly how many of those had reached people at that point. But there is still clearly enough recognition behind the Turok name for Disney to move a lot of copies into the market. And a sequel was planned, but that never came out. And after that, new Turok games basically disappeared for years. What eventually brought the original games back was Night Dive. Night Dive remastered Dinosaur Hunter first and followed it with Seeds of Evil, which is what I played here today in the video. I feel like the remaster is much easier to watch, instead of seeing me fight N64 controls. Their version of Turok 2 released on PC in 2017 and eventually made its way to modern consoles. And Night Dive has continued supporting it. In 2025, just last year, Turok 2 received another major update that brought the Kex engine forward again, and added support for higher refresh rates and 4K on hardware that can use it. It also received cinematic subtitles and continued work on its cross-platform multiplayer. So this game from 1998 is still being actively maintained more than 25 years later. And if you want something closer to the original N64 experience, that's been preserved too. Nintendo added Turok 2 Seeds of Evil to the Nintendo Switch Online Expansion Pak library, back in October of 24. That's a pretty good place for the game to end up. Acclaim went bankrupt, the original license changed hands. The series went through a reboot, then went quiet, and somehow Seeds of Evil survived all of that. You can play a modernized version that cleans up a lot of the friction, or you can go back and play the N64 release and see what Iguana actually managed to get running on that hardware in '98. And now Turok's moving again. At the Game Awards in December of '24, Saber Interactive revealed Turok Origins. It's taken the series in a bit of a new direction with third-person combat and co-op, with players using weapons alongside abilities gained through DNA collected from creatures. And the part I find really interesting and exciting is what game director Jesus Iglesias said when they announced it. He talked about the original Turok games having a big impact on the team growing up. He specifically pointed towards the explorable maps and the mixture of dinosaurs with alien technology as things that stuck with them. So almost 30 years after Dinosaur Hunter, there are developers building another Turok game, while openly talking about the ideas those original games left with them. And when I look back at Seeds of Evil, I can understand why this is one of the entries that stayed with people. I think this is a fantastic sequel. The first game gave Iguana a foundation that already worked. Turok 2 gave them room to start building on almost every part of it. The levels became these huge places that you gradually learn your way through. The objectives gave those worlds more purpose. The arsenal kept growing until Turok was carrying some of the strangest weapons you could find in a shooter at the time. The enemies became more reactive, and the damage system gave those weapons a level of brutality that still stands out on the N64. There are rough edges that come with all that. The frame rate could struggle. Some of those levels ask a lot from you. The original save system could demand way more time than somebody had available in one setting. Those things are part of playing the original release. But when I think about what Turok 2 was trying to do, I keep coming back to how much Iguana trusted the foundation they had built. They had a successful first game behind them, more room on the cartridge, and new technology to work with, and they used that opportunity to see how far Turok could go. So what was Turok 2 Seeds of Evil? For me, it was the game where Turok fully became the series I remember. It's where the Lost Land started feeling like it could contain almost anything. It's where the weapons went completely off the rails, but in the best way. And it's where a character I had already loved as a kid became attached to memories that have stayed with me my entire life. Coming back to it now, I can finally appreciate all those things I was too young to understand when I was sitting at my grandma's house, replaying the port of Adia over and over again. Back then, I didn't need to understand the objectives. I didn't need to know who Primagen was. I just knew I loved being Turok. And after finally going all the way through Seeds of Evil as an adult, I think I understand why that stuck with me.
Child rescued.
Thank you, Turok.
And that's Turok 2 Seeds of Evil. I really appreciate y'all hanging out with me for a bit. If you're new here and you enjoyed the video, be sure to subscribe. There's a ton of content like this already on the channel, and there's always more coming. If you want to help the video grow, leave it a like and drop a comment down below. I'd love to hear what your memories are with Turok 2, especially if you grew up playing this one like I did. If you haven't seen it yet, be sure to go check out my video on the first Turok. I go way deeper into the history of the character there, including the comics and how the series eventually made its way into video games. I also want to give a huge shout out to all the members of the channel and to everyone who supported the Turok streams with super chats. You all are amazing, and I seriously appreciate it. If you ever want a chance to make it into one of these videos, try to swing by one of the streams and pop into chat. I've been using a lot of the stream footage in the videos recently, and it's been really cool getting some of you more involved into the community and just seeing the community grow in general. It's really cool. But thank you all again. I hope you enjoyed the video, and as always, I'll see y'all later.
Child rescued.